Morning, everyone. See, we still have
Good morning, good morning.
almost everyone is still, everyone's in from the waiting room. Good morning, everyone. Thank you guys all for joining. My name is Debokholi Kubu from the Southern African Liaison Office, and I would like to thank you guys for joining this dialogue today. And on behalf of SALO, I'd like to warmly welcome you guys to this virtual multi-stakeholder dialogue on South Africa's G20 presidency. Titled Reflections and Pathways for Consolidations of Gains, sorry. We appreciate your time and your participation in what is a timely and necessary conversation. South Africa's G20 presidency has now formally concluded, and the process has been handed over to the United States. This transition makes an important moment or marks an important moment for reflection, not only on what was achieved during South Africa's tenure, but also on the broader geopolitical and institutional dynamics shaping the G20 going forward. It's particularly important to note that this handover is taking place amid growing uncertainty. South Africa has not been invited into certain engagements under the incoming US presidency, which raises concerns about exclusion, continuity, and the future role of emerging economies and African voices specifically within G20 processes. This context underscores why today's dialogue matters. Reflection is not simply about documenting past activities or outputs. It's about assessing what substantive gains were made, what influence was exercised, and how or whether those gains can be protected and consolidated in an evolving and increasingly fragmented global environment. South Africa's presidency took place during a period of overlapping global crises, climate shocks, economic instability, rising inequality, and heightened geopolitical rivalry. The G20 remains one of the few multilateral spaces where these issues can be addressed collectively, but its legitimacy depends on inclusion, consistency, and meaningful participation by the global South. So today's discussion therefore asks a difficult but necessary questions. What remains of South Africa's G20 legacy once the presidency has ended? How do non-state actors such as labor, business, women, youth, and civil society sustain momentum when political conditions shift? And what does consolidation of gains mean when multilateral cooperation itself is under strain? We've deliberately convened a multi-stakeholder panel to engage these questions. The perspectives represented here from the African Union, government, labor, business, women's formations, youth, and civil society reflect the breadth of the G20 ecosystem and the importance of coherence across these tracks. And I'd like to thank our chair, Busisiwe Ngumalo, and all of our speakers who will be contributing today for their insights, and our participants for joining us from across South Africa, the continent, and beyond. Our intention today is not to offer definitive answers, but to contribute to a grounded, forward-looking conversation about what must be safeguarded, what must be strengthened, and how South Africa and actors more broadly continue to assert relevance and influence within global governance processes, even as the terrain becomes more contested. So thank you very much to everyone for joining today. Just a few technical notices from me. As you guys will notice, today's meeting is being recorded. Today's meeting is public, so it will be available on our YouTube channels as well at some point after today's meeting. Please, if you can, keep yourselves muted throughout the first section of the discussion, which will be dedicated to the speakers. And then our second session will then be open for discussion, where you guys can please come in, contribute, raise questions, and overall engage with today's session. I'd like to thank you guys all for joining once again, one more time. And I will now hand over to my colleague, Busisiwe Ngumalo, who will be chairing today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dorogo, for that wonderful opening remarks. As we said, that my name is Busisiwe Ngumalo. I'm also part of SALO. I'm very excited to hear from our wonderful panel this morning, and we're just going to kick off and start. I'm going to start off by reading the speaker's bio and then passing it over to the speaker to do their presentation. So the first speaker that we have today is His Excellency Ambassador William Kalu. He is the head of the African Union ECOSOC Secretariat based in Lusaka, Zambia. He has also provided overall leadership and management support in establishing missions in Lusaka. He has cultivated strategic partnerships and coordination platforms with civil society organizations across the continent and globally, as well as the African Union organs and international partners. His work has included spearheading the integration of African Union priorities into program design, implementation across partnership frameworks, coordinating the identification of policy implications, and monitoring policy environments to the relevant implementation of the AU's development strategies. He also has more than 20 years of experience in the international development with local and international NGOs across Africa and Southeast Asia. So over to you, Ambassador. Ambassador, over to you. We can see your screen and your presentation. Ambassador, can you hear us? Yes.
Yeah, are you getting me?
Yes, we can.
And thank you very much. I hope you can still see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to express thanks to SALO for the great work you've been doing, especially with regards engagement around the G20. I'm very happy to speak at this virtual public stakeholder dialogue that seek to take stock of the 2025 G20 year, and more fundamentally, to reflect on the role, positioning, and the continued relevance of civil society engagement in the G20 and the broader multilateral spaces or multilateral processes going forward. If you can look from my slide, I am struggling to actually move the slide. I don't know whether you can be able to assist me from your end. I don't know.
Yes,
the technical team will be able. You have the slide, right?
I don't have the slides, but if you can just share them with me, I can put them up and then.
Let me just forward right away. I don't know what is the problem with my.
Forward them in the...
Yeah. So I will be speaking through whilst I share it. Just 1 minute. Sorry for the delay on it. Okay. Dr. Raj, are you on the call? Can you share with... is Dr. Raj on the call?
I think it
Yes,
is.
Ambassador. I'll share it with colleagues.
Yes, then I will really appreciate. Okay, so I think I'll just continue whilst Dr. Raj will share the slide with you. So as I was indicating, I want to say thank you to SALO for the great job that you've done. And I think as we transition from South Africa historic G20 presidency, this is our moment to basically consolidate gains and chart the path forward. And therefore, I see that today, engagement or stakeholder engagement is a very important one. And from the African Union ECOSOC point of view, I am speaking on behalf of 1.4 billion Africans, considering the fact that the African Union is our continental body that represents the continent and its people. And therefore, we're not speaking as observers of global governance, but as authors of our own destiny. And it will be important as we look at this conversation for me to first and foremost look at what is the mandate of ECOSOC in this regard. So let's stay on this slide. What is the mandate of ECOSOC in this regard? Let me be clear about ECOSOC's role. We are not just another civil society organization. As you all are aware, we are the African Union's official advisory organ that is established by Article 5 of the African Union Constitutive Act. And as you also are aware, ECOSOC was designated as an AU knowledge partner for the G20 by the Executive Council decision of the AU during the summit when South Africa was having the presidency of the G20. So it will be important for our audience to know who we are and what we represent. In terms of authority, when ECOSOC speaks, we speak with the legitimacy of the 55 member states of the African Union, the consolidated voice of African citizens through an established body by the African Union to provide input into the policies and program of the African Union and play a critical role in serving as a bridge between African citizens and their policymakers. In terms of representation, like I said at my introductory, 1.4 billion Africans across the various sectors. We bring that kind of representation when we speak. We do not speak for governments, but we speak for the African people and the people in the diaspora. Let's move to the next slide, please. We look at Africa historic G20 moment. And you all will agree that South Africa's presidency was Providence meeting preparation. The time has come for Africa to transition from subject of global policy to principal author of it. And let me put it this way, or let me put it in context with stark realities. When we look at the statistical power within this multilateral space, I'm repeating this over and over again because it is very important. We have, as Africa, 30% of the world's mineral reserves. But unfortunately, we remain an extractive periphery, not necessarily a value-added center. Let's look at the arable land. 60% of the world's arable land is in Africa. Yet, we are still battling with food insecurity that persists in our situation. Why? Due to unjust trade frameworks and many other policy frameworks that does not favor our African continent. When we look at issues related to climate change and the likes, less than 4% of global emissions when we look at the African situation. Yet we bear the catastrophic brunt of climate change in our continent. These are stark realities looking at Africa in terms of our positioning and what we bring on the table in a multilateral space. Let's move to the next slides. What we achieved together. So what did African civil society actually achieve during this G20? For me, it is not only about symbolic participation, but it's more concrete, measurable impact that I saw. And some of the quick facts that you will want to know in terms of our policy input, African Union ECOSOC play a critical role working with the South African government so that we play a critical role and contribute meaningfully, especially during the social summit. We produce or contributed over 12 policy inputs that were integrated into the G20 working groups. I think for me that is significant. In terms of technical experts' contribution, leveraging on our pool of experts, we brought on board over 200 African representatives across the various engagement groups during the G20 processes. In terms of mobilization, through ECOSOC platform, we mobilized over 1,000 civil society organization representatives that were in attendance at the social summit. Those who participated directly as a result of our engagement through our various channels and social media platform, those who were following us through our virtual platforms, those who engaged through the various channels that were provided by the South African government. I think this was significant and it was a huge success. We also produced 15 position papers, over 15 position papers which were basically establishing our technical expertise as an advisory organ of the African Union. So for me, when I looked at some of these statistical evidence in terms of what we achieved, they are not vanity metrics. Each, in my view, represent African priorities that were inserted into global economic governance framework. They were very important in terms of looking at what the realities were and how African citizens can play a critical role in contributing into issues that pertain to their development. Next slide, please. Where we shaped outcome, and I think this is very critical for this conversation. And I would like to give some example to show how impactful we have been in Johannesburg last November. If you look at the C20, for instance, they led the climate justice working groups, and African Just Transition Frameworks made it into the leaders' recommendation. I think for me, that is very critical because these were critical issues that we were discussing. When you look at the B20, secured private sector commitment for renewable energy partnerships in Africa. This was huge. The L20, workers' rights in climate adaptation, influenced the ILO G20 declarations. If you look at the W20, the gender responsive policies, shape financial inclusion framework, whilst the Y20 youth unemployment prioritize across innovation dialogue. These were critical areas that we can pinpoint and point finger at to say African citizens were able to their deliberation, their conversation, were able to provide critical input that were very impactful in terms of how we shape the outcome of the G20. Let's move to the next slide. In terms of constraints, and I think it is very important for us to speak candidly. Achievement does not tell the full story if we don't address the structural barriers. Our gains will be temporary. And therefore, I think as we look at the success of the G20, it is also critical for us to look at what were the persistent constraints and how we can play a part in ensuring that moving forward, we're able to put mechanism in place to be able to counter or address some of these. For this presentation, I'm looking at 5 constraints that demands our attention. And the first one is the structural inequality. When you look at the G20 architecture, it's dominated, especially from the civil society point of view, and in every other sector, by global North civil society, with institutional memory that we don't have from the African Union point of view, or from the African continent point of view. So the structural inequality is one major constraint that we need to look into. The second is the aspect of resource asymmetries. If you look at issues related to traveling, the technical expertise, the year-round capacity, these are very expensive kind of engagement. Do African civil society organizations have the capacity and the resources to be able to participate and able to actively involve and play a part and contribute meaningfully into this process? This is an area of challenge that we need to look at. The third aspect, which, I mean, it's not a secret, it's we all know within the G20 framework, is the weak enforcement. The G20 promises, as we all know, lack the binding mechanism. And we do fear that many of South Africa's commitments will fade because of the fact that there's no binding commitment. So how do we ensure that the various stakeholders play a critical role in terms of engagement to see how these commitments, they don't just fade away, but we're able to have practical implementation of them? The fourth constraint I would want to look at is the fragmented coordination. African civil society operates in silos. We have to face that reality. And in our view, it reduces our collective power. You can rally the voices through institutions. And that is the reason why I've always been saying, what is the role of ECOSOC? Yes, we did play a critical role in partnership with the South African government. But is this an institutional mechanism that we are putting in place so that whatever we are doing, it is being done through an institutional process, and we have a feedback mechanism in terms of reporting back to the African Union. And therefore, we can be able to have a much more structural engagement in terms of coordinating civil society, working with relevant stakeholders within the civil society fraternity to be able to push this agenda. And the last constraint I will want to look at is the knowledge gaps. The G20 processes, as you all know, are technically complex. And therefore, when we're dealing with civil society, especially grassroots, we need specialized expertise to be able to break down this information so that there is a sense of ownership when they have a better understanding on the issues that are being articulated at this multilateral stage, especially issues that pertain to their development. These are 5 critical constraints that we want to bring forward so that as we look at the successes, the achievement, we should also not lose fact of the fact that there were challenges, because it's able to give us a much more clarity in terms of picture as to how we move forward. Let's move to the next slide in terms of solidarity in action. And I think solidarity is not just a slogan. For us, it is our new battle cry. And therefore, ECOSOC, we thought it's necessary to propose 3 strategic pillars in order to translate solidarity into concrete, measurable, and irreversible change. It is very important that we don't just talk about solidarity and it appear to look like a slogan, but what are we doing to translate solidarity into concrete, measurable, and irreversible change? And looking at these 3 strategic pillars that I want to propose, one is to institutionalize continental coordination. And how do we institutionalize continental coordination? I mentioned ECOSOC being an African Union civil society organ. And therefore, we are saying, how do we establish ECOSOC-led G20 coordination platform? It's a permanent AU function, not necessarily to project us as an institution, but to play the coordinating role of which the African Union established this organ as a platform or as a bridge for civil society and policymakers, so that we're able to coordinate and get in perspective of citizens and bring it to the table of policymakers. The second under strategic institutionalized continental coordination is to create knowledge hub, where we're able to track processes, publish accountability scorecard, and we're able to be seen doing some of the things that are very important within this process. And then lastly, under the first pillar, is to build the technical capacity of the African civil society as experts, not just as advocates. Because all what we have seen is civil society organization advocating for some of these issues. But how do we ensure that we build their capacity so they go beyond the advocacy space and be able to play much more critical role in this endeavor? The second strategic pillar that I want to talk about is how we strengthen strategic partnership, which is very critical, especially looking at civil society engagement. One is for us to be able to secure a multi-year institutional funding. You all are aware that no project will sustain when they don't have support. And we have clearly indicated one of the constraints to be resources. And therefore, if we don't have resources that is available for our civil society to be able to play their own meaningful role, then it will just be a symbolic kind of participation without any significant contribution. The second aspect is how we leverage the African Union G20 Compact for formal recognition of civil society, especially through a body like ECOSOC, so that ECOSOC is being recognized to play this leadership role, in especially coordination role. Because whatever is being done in the periphery, how do we bring it into the African Union so that the African Union able to take it to the multilateral phase? This is where we have the strength, and I think we should be able to take advantage to leverage it. The third is to build the Global South Alliance to counter the northern dominance. We will explore how we can leverage on, for instance, looking at the Indians' BRICS leadership this year, so that we're able to sustain the South Africa's momentum, so that it doesn't be like a one-off event and we tick the box to say it was a successful conference and it becomes the end of it. But how do we move further so that we build on this momentum? Because some of these issues will continue to be discussed in various multilateral stages, and therefore it's very important. The third strategic pillar is how we enhance evidence-based advocacy, so that we are not just advocating on issues because it is being heard from the radio or in the TV or in the news, but how do we commission rigorous research, building independent analytical capacity? Very important, because the issues we are talking about need evidence, so that even when we're advocating from an evidence point of view. How do we develop data-driven tools and dashboard for accountability? We need accountability so that as we advocate, we're able to track some of the things that are being done. And more significantly, how do we document South Africa Presidency's lessons learned? It is important for us to be able to document these lessons learned so that we're able to utilize those information within our various stakeholder grouping. The next slide, please, which will be more or less my last slides. And this is basically looking at 2026 and beyond. And the work does not stop when South Africa Presidency changes. The G20 is now, like my brother rightly said, in the hands of the US. What does sustained engagement look like? So that it doesn't appear to say we had a successful G20, especially looking at the current rift in terms of how things will look like moving forward. And therefore, it is important for us to be able to mobilize ourselves as we engage. And in terms of timeline and how these timelines are breakdown, we are looking at, for instance, we are already in 2026 in the quarter one. What are the immediate things that needs to be done? Have we captured the institutional memory? Have we established a coordination platform to engage with the US at a very early stage, especially looking at how we want some of our recommendations moving forward? Of course, we're all aware of the current situation, but what are we doing in order to be able to ensure that the outcome of the South African Presidency G20 is not going to just be an outcome document, but how do we ensure that these outcome documents have a meaningful breakthrough? So immediately we need to begin to look at quarter one, where there is possibility to capture institutional memory, establish a proper coordination platform for engagement. How do we move into the midterm between 2026 to 2027? We need to be able to maintain presence across all groups. How do we advocate for South Africa's commitment implementation? And more fundamentally, how do we build the Global South Coalition? These are areas which I think if we're able to look at the immediate and the midterm, it will be very significant to ensure that what we have as outcome will not just be an outcome for the paper. And in terms of long term, and that is now beyond 2027, and this is where, especially from the civil society point of view, I think one of the areas that we want to work with various stakeholders is to see how we position ECOSOC as a permanent interface for multilateral governance, especially within the civil society framework. Because we have seen so many civil society bodies being established, but these are ad hoc bodies. They are not institutionalized bodies. And it should not only be for the G20, but we have the IMF, we have the World Bank, we have the WTO, we have the OECD. These are all platforms where you want to have civil society interface so that civil society also bring in the civil society perspective or the citizenry perspective into this multilateral space, especially on decisions that pertain to their development. And therefore, if we're able to position an institution which is within the framework of the African Union, it's a permanent interface for multilateral governance engagement, then we can be able to have a much more structured and coordinated approach in terms of our engagement in all these multilateral processes. We're all aware that you can sustain influence But for you to be able to sustain that influence, it requires a sustained presence. And therefore, for us to be able to be meaningful and contribute meaningfully in all these processes, I think it's important for us to have an institutionalized mechanism, especially within civil society, to provide citizenry input in all these processes, especially the G20 and some of the other platforms that I have clearly indicated. So I will want to stop here, but just to indicate that as African Union ECOSOC, this is an organ that was established by the African Union. It's an organ that has a responsibility in terms of how you provide a bridge between citizen and policymakers. And therefore, it's important for us to be able to utilize and leverage on the legitimacy and authority that the member states themselves have given to this organ, so that we're able to bring in the perspectives of citizens and build that strong partnership between government and civil society, especially on issues that affect citizens within our continent. Thank you very much for giving ECOSOC the opportunity to share. And I want to conclude by saying we look forward to working with institutions like yours and many others to see how we can play a critical part, to see how we can institutionalize mechanism and move forward with some of the commitments and successes that came out from the South Africa Presidency G20. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that very comprehensive input and really highlighting to us the different segments and roles which the G20 was played for from the different sectors, as well as strengthening a strategic partnership, which is very key, and the Global South Alliance, and how we also continue to engage in sustained engagement moving forward. We really thank you for that. We're going to be moving on to our next speaker, which is the second speaker of the day. We're going to go to Mr. Masocha Mnguni, who is South Africa's G20 project coordinator in the Sherpa track from Durka. And Mr. Mnguni is also the Director of Economic Development at Durka. In his role, he's responsible for coordinating Sherpa track working groups and advancing South Africa's G20 presidency, priorities with a focus on global South concerns, as well as sustainable development, debt sustainability, and energy transitions and critical minerals. He has also represented South Africa in key multilateral forums, including the C20 Summit, the IBSA engagements, and has also played an active role in broadening public participation in the G20 through community engagements. So over to you, Mr. Nguni.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Busisiwe Nxumalo, for that very generous introduction. I also thank my dear brother, the speaker before me, Ambassador William Keru, for that very rich input and conversation starter. I also take this opportunity to acknowledge my fellow panelists, the program facilitator, as well as all the participants. Colleagues, we convene this discussion shortly after, as the South African G20 team returned from Davos, Switzerland, for the annual World Economic Forum discussions. One of the tasks, of course, of our participation there was to take forward some of the G20 legacy outcomes, which were warmly received by the World Economic Forum. But most importantly, we came back with an important mandate, which is to convene the next World Economic Forum spring meeting in 2027. That is next year, the second of its kind anywhere in the world, largely because of the agenda which we put together during our presidency. But this is something that I will talk to later on in my discussion. Another important moment, which I think warrants us to reflect on, occurred in Davos. It was a moment where the global order, as we know it, was questioned. For example, some like the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, referred to it as a rupture in the world order. This means that the post-World War II global governance architecture, including its financial institution, has never been under such a scrutiny. We also saw the launch of what is called the Board of Peace by President Trump. And this, of course, has raised questions about the future of the United Nations and multilateralism, including, of course, the bedrock of that order, which is the UN Charter. This reality, which is confronting us as we are having this discussion, then calls on us to be analytically alert, as Ambassador Keru mentioned in his presentation, without, of course, losing the strategic consistency, which has been the focal or the focus of South Africa's foreign policy since at least 1994, one which prioritizes rules-based international law, the issue, of course, of the promotion of human rights, resolution of conflict through dialogue, and so forth. But also, the last thing we will need to look at is what tactical flexibility are we going to exercise in order to adjust to this shift, which I have mentioned. For example, the Canadian Prime Minister called for an alliance of like-minded middle power countries who share the same values as a counterforce to this great power rivalry we are witnessing. And South Africa, of course, is fortunate to belong to groupings across the North-South divide, be it the G20 or the BRICS plus G77 from the south of the side of the global south. So I just wanted then to start by painting that context, so that at least as we have this conversation, we do not lose sight of the current developments that are unfolding with far-reaching consequences on the international order as we know it. Moving then to the core task of my presentation, which is to reflect on the outcomes of South Africa's G20 presidency, which has largely been referred to as successful. But I must underscore that my use of the word successful is not based on mere rhetoric, but rather on evidence and substance. Distinguished participants, when we had the honor of taking over the presidency of the G20 in December last year, we appreciated the enormous responsibility entrusted on us to guide the work of the G20, which, of course, as you know, is the premier forum of international economic cooperation. We understood that the sheer heft or size of the G20, which represents approximately 85% of the world's GDP, more than 75% of world trade, and around 2/3 of the world's population, makes it a relevant and important platform. You will recall that the G20, upon its inception, initially focused on broad macroeconomic issues, but over time it expanded its agenda to inter alia include issues of core interest to the majority of the global population, such as trade, sustainable development, health, education, science and technology, agriculture, climate change, amongst others. As such, the decisions taken by the G20 have a direct impact on the lives of all members of the global community. Coincidentally, as we have this conversation now, the current presidency of the G20, that is the US, has contended that the G20 has deviated from its original mandate. It is then for that reason why then they have sought to return the G20 back to its basics. So that is another question we have to contend with, because as I am saying, that the agenda of the G20 evolved organically to be what it was, at least by the time South Africa took over the chair of the G20, with the increased agenda and focus of the Sherpa track. We have had engagement groups. We even convene the social summit because of the, as I said, the strategic importance of the G20 to some of these areas. And of course, now you are having this counter argument that this represents a deviation of the G20 from its original mandate. So I think as we then engage in discussions, this is one of the issues we will have to examine. As a founder member of the G20 from the developing world, our G20 presidency provided us with the opportunity to ensure that the development priorities of the Global South and Africa especially find expression firmly and permanently onto the agenda of the G20. And of course, when we look at the Leaders' Declaration or the Johannesburg Declaration, we will see that for the first time ever, this was the most comprehensive declaration on African issues, not in terms of only referring to Africa, but in terms of the deliverables itself. But I will talk to that before I conclude the presentation. To continue then, our assessment has been that focusing on developmental issues contributes to human development, which is the foundation of long-term growth, and reduces inequality between and within nations, and leads to a more sustainable growth, and is a moral and ethical imperative. This, of course, is a response to this back to basics argument advanced by some who have maintained that the G20 should be primarily concerned with matters related to the stewardship of the global economy only. But of course, as important as that is, the flip side of the argument is that the global economy can also be channeled towards developmental issues stability, as well as markets. You don't need one or the other. Then let me move from the abstract to the concrete by then looking at the tangible markers of success of South Africa's G20 presidency. The first marker of the success of our presidency was that we took over the G20 presidency against the well-documented, highly fractious geopolitical environment that came into being following a series of presidential elections that brought about several changes in most of the G20 countries. Of course, the most consequential being that of the United States. This also resulted in ideological shifts, including pushbacks on the progressive agenda. So South Africa aimed to consolidate this progressive agenda following 3 successive presidencies from the Global South, namely of Indonesia, India, and Brazil. The reactionary pushback led by forces who proudly refer to themselves as disruptors sought to undermine rules-based multilateralism and the centrality and respect of the UN Charter, its principles and purposes. The gains made in the fight against climate change and mobilizing finance for a just energy transition, gender equality, promoting diversity, equality and inclusion, accelerating progress to implement sustainable development goals and related Agenda 2030, the consolidation of the Africa agenda, and of course the reform of the international system of global governance, including the international financial architecture. So in response to this pushback, our collective response, our clarion call in South Africa, was that the world needed more solidarity, equality, and sustainability, which, as you know, became the theme that undergirded the work we did during our presidency, year-long presidency, comprising of some 132 meetings that were held across South Africa, the African continent, and some even at the United Nations in New York. Distinguished participants, time does not allow me to go through all the achievements of our presidency, but please allow me to just share a few of these outcomes, which we also intend to implement during the better part of this year through forums such as SADC, the African Union, and the United Nations. We put forward 4 high-level priorities, namely taking action to strengthen disaster resilience and response. Secondly, ensuring debt sustainability for low-income countries. You'll recall that for the first time during a G20 presidency, there was a ministerial declaration on debt, which was adopted by the finance track. The third high-level priority was on mobilizing predictable and increased finance for a just energy transition. And fourthly, harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. And here again, for the first time, the G20 managed to produce a very intensely negotiated critical minerals framework, which we also intend to take to some of the important regional and sub-regional fora, such as SADC and the African Union. We also, of course, did work on 3 task forces, namely inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and reduced inequality. We had a task force on food security, and then lastly, a task force on artificial intelligence, data governance, and innovation for sustainable development. During our presidency, we advanced and elevated or broadened a compact with Africa, which saw the launch of its second phase, which was also supported by the establishment of the World Group Multi-Donor Fund. During the Leaders Summit in Johannesburg in November last year, the leaders noted the reforms undertaken by the Compact with Africa partners to enhance their investment climate, and the newest members of the Compact, namely the Republic of Zambia and the Republic of Angola. Of course, in this partnership, we are working closely with Germany, who oversaw the first phase of the compact with Africa during their G20 presidency back in 2017. We also, for the first time, produced an important report called the G20 at 20 review. You would remember that South Africa's presidency of the G20 marked the conclusion of the first cycle of G20 presidencies. So then this was an important moment for the G20 to assess how it has performed as a grouping and also evolved as a grouping during its first cycle. But most importantly, then coming up with recommendations in terms of how the G20 can be made fit for purpose for the current climate. And if you look at that report, not only does it look at how the agenda should be managed, but it also speaks on the importance and value of making the G20 more inclusive. So this talks to the important role of engagement groups, the value of having the guest countries and also the international organizations participating in the G20. So I would urge all that are interested to have a look at that important report. Some of the other key outcomes include the voluntary infrastructure investment action plan, which of course aims to drive clean cooking solutions and reduce the 2 million annual deaths linked to unsafe household fuels. The G20 also endorsed the high-level voluntary principles for sustainable industrialization hubs. We also saw the launch of the AI for Africa initiative as a platform for multilateral cooperation. We, of course, also launched the Ubuntu Legacy Initiative, which was done in partnership with the African Development Bank. It aims to unlock and accelerate cross-border infrastructure projects. We also launched the Africa Engagement Framework and the G20 Africa Cooperation Agenda as a mechanism to mobilize investment, strengthen the African Continental Free Trade Area implementation, and support the African Union's Agenda 2063. We, of course, launched the roadmap towards the implementation of voluntary and non-binding high-level principles on combating illicit financial flows. I also mentioned that we adopted the G20 critical minerals framework, which is a voluntary and non-binding blueprint to ensure that critical minerals resources become a driver of prosperity and sustainable development. Over and above these deliverables, there were also strong commitments on important issues in the leaders' declaration, such as a commitment to Agenda 2030 and SDGs, universal social protection, commitment to tackling climate change, committing to advance universal health coverage, and strengthening the capacity for pandemic prevention and preparedness. Of course, we also committed to gender equality and the empowerment of young people through the Nelson Mandela Bay target, amongst others. We also strengthened a partnership and expanded a dialogue during our presidency with a wide range of actors outside of government, which was evident on how the work of engagement groups were integrated in the presidency, including the convening of the second G20 social summit after the one which was held in Rio de Janeiro. As I conclude, let me highlight also important reports which were commissioned under our G20 presidency, namely the G20 Africa Expert Panel on Growth, Debt and Development, which was chaired by the former Minister of Finance, Mr. Trevor Manuel. This report provides practical proposal aimed at realizing a more equitable and inclusive global economic order. The second report which we commissioned is the G20 Extraordinary Committee of Independent Experts on Global Inequality, which was chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz. This report makes crucial recommendations, including the call for the establishment of a new international panel on inequality to inform policy making internationally and by governments, inspired by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And as I mentioned when I started the presentation, these two reports will be tabled before the AU Summit next month for their endorsement before they are taken to the United Nations General Assembly. In particular, the second report on inequality, because in order for this international panel on equality to exist, it needs a United Nations General Assembly resolution. But of course, as we start with this work of preparing for the launch of the International Panel on Inequality, we'll be having a multi-stakeholder consultation. So we will welcome all your contribution in terms of what then this international panel on inequality should focus on. And then let me close by posing a couple of questions, because as you know, this year is a bit of a gap year for South Africa due to our exclusion from the US presidency for reasons, I think, which all of us are aware of, given the publicity that the issue has gained. But let me reiterate the statement issued by the South African government that South Africa remains a member of the G20 in its own name and right. Its G20 membership is at the behest of all other members. South Africa is a sovereign, constitutional, democratic country, and we therefore will continue to participate as a full, active, and constructive member of the G20. We call on all members of the G20 to reaffirm this fact of our continued participation in the G20 during the first Sherpa meeting, which was held in the United States last December. Having said that, we need to grapple with the following strategic questions. One, what are the consequences for the G20 as we know it, arising from South Africa's exclusion from the US presidency? Will the G20 be able to recover from this decision? Two, what deliberate actions from outside the G20 are necessary to keep the legacy of South Africa's historic presidency alive? In other words, what partnerships both within government and outside government needs to be forged? For example, as I just stated, how do we take up the report of the G20 Extraordinary Committee on Global Inequality? Three, bearing in mind that one of the key recommendations of the inequality report is the creation of the International Panel on Inequality. What alliances then should South Africa forge as we take this important work to the United Nations General Assembly? Four, what is our collective assessment of the US's G20 presidency, so-called back to basics approach, that is returning the G20 to its roots in inverted commas and focusing on creating space for G20 leaders to engage on economic issues only? What does this mean for the advancement of the developmental agenda within the G20 or the Sherpa track as we know it? And then lastly, what does the exclusion of guest countries, international organizations, and engagement groups from the US G20 presidency mean for the to the intention of the G20 to become more inclusive, as commended by the G20 20 review report? Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator, and apologies for being a bit long. So I shall stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ngoni, for that excellent input. We really do appreciate it. Thanks for highlighting that South Africa's G20 indeed was a success. There's no debate around that. And also highlighting the historical nature of the G20 and how we got here in terms of the macroeconomic issues, as well as how it's shifted, including the co-interest of the majority of the global population, and also the decisions that are taken within the G20 also really do impact the lives of the global community. And we always need to ensure that development priorities are always finding expression in the G20, which is what you've highlighted. And the Leaders' Declaration, which is the most important, is that it has been very comprehensive in attributing to African voices and deliverables. Thank you so much, Mr. Ngoni. We're now going to be moving on to our next speaker, which is Mr. Matthew Parks. I just want to check if they are in the room. Okay, I see they are. Okay, thanks. Mr. Matthew Parks represents the L20 and he serves as the parliamentary coordinator for COSATU, a role he has played for over a decade. He coordinates COSATU's engagement with Parliament, government, and social partners on legislation, policy, and regulatory processes, including the NEDLAC and bilateral engagements with business and industry. With more than 2 decades of parliamentary experience and legislative process at a national and provincial work level, his work spans from a range of policy areas, including labor, fiscal, policy, education, health, industrial development. He also holds a Bachelor of Social Sciences from the University of Cape Town, and as well as a postgraduate diploma in governance from the University of the Western Cape. Over to you, Mr. Matthew Parks.
Morning, colleagues. Thanks for inviting us. Yeah, so I'm from COSATU, the largest federation of trade unions in the country. But our work on the L20, the labor stream of the G20, was a collective program of the 4 different federations in South Africa. So that's COSATU, FEDUSA, NACTU, and SAFTU. That's the 4 labor federations which are represented at NEDLAC. So thanks for inviting us just to come and share some of our views and thoughts. I think at the outset, what was key for us in the G20 process was a couple of things, and I think they largely overlapped with government colleagues too, with the South African government, and I think broader, supporting, defending multilateralism, also defending the principles of non-alignment, the African agenda, the global South, the developmental agenda. But I guess what would be unique from our point, and the whole purpose of the L20 was about workers' inputs. How do you try to anchor G20 and its objectives, etc., commitments on the needs of workers, working class communities, especially in the South, etc. And so, Chair, this last year's G20 and L20 kind of built upon the previous year's G20 in Brazil, where I think for the first time you had a labor stream, and also kind of from similar but smaller efforts in India the previous year. So yeah, there's a full kind of blown work stream. We've been quite busy with it for about a year. Extensive discussion with South African federations, but also federations invited from other G20 states. So whether it's from the US or from Europe, etc., or across the world. I don't think we had any real disagreements amongst the labor group. I think we're all broadly aligned on those kind of principles of advancing labor rights, decent work, development, the objectives of fair trade. How do you tackle climate change, the need for a just transition? I think we had, quite supportive of government's efforts around debt relief, the principles of solidarity and equality. So we really had a very few, if any, disagreements with the government on those objectives. In fact, South African government had also consulted with us before even identifying those objectives. So there was, a lot of inclusion, and I think, the South African government did well in terms of approaching it as a bit of a partnership with social partners, be it business or labor or civil society, etc. So I think that's why we had such a unified, so to speak, perspective. Our L20 activities, quite a few. I mean, we began, in fact, almost the previous year already. But, the kind of formal launch, February, April, and so forth. Most of our meetings were also coordinated with the work stream of ministers of labor from the government perspective. And so even when the labor work stream of government met, we also had representation there of a few people from ourselves and from ITUC, the International Trade Union Congress, to participate in those ministerial work streams and to kind of get feedback from our engagements as a labor leg, so to speak. Chair, we also, did participate in the social summit as well in November last year. Obviously, that was a much larger, much more diverse, much more inclusive, etc. approach. But I think, Chair, we really saw value. I think the government was correct to try to say, let this not just be a discussion of politicians to politicians. Let it be inclusive of society, be it business or labor or civil society, and let it try to speak to the material conditions that workers face in a changing environment, that businesses even face too, and society too. So I think for us that was a useful thing. That really fits into South Africa's social compact philosophy. It links to NEDLAC, etc. Chair, I think the G20 summit we viewed it as being a success. Of course, the proof is always in the pudding, where those positive English words move from being on paper to practical action, be it on investments, be it on trade, improving workers' rights, etc., amongst other countries. And that you only would see in the following year, the year after that, etc. But I think also government did well to manage to avoid and to not be distracted by the geopolitical tensions, almost the kind of weaponization of trade relations, and of course, the frequent unfair critiques, attacks against South Africa's hosting the G20 from the beginning of the discussion from the US government colleagues. We thought those attacks were really unfair, and we don't expect in the G20 all governments to agree. That would not be likely. But we felt there's space for engagement. But it was what it is. It's unfortunate. But I think government did well not to kind of get involved in a punch-up, which would not be helpful, which would just distract. It's unfortunate, Chair, that, this year we won't be invited as a country to the G20. I think, those issues have been exhausted. We don't need to kind of relitigate them. But I think, we do support government's view that that's a temporary commercial break. And I think there has been positive discussions between our government, DIRCO, with the counterparts in other G20 states, especially with Britain, which will host the next year's summit. So, and I think that's the right approach. We don't need to commit suicide if we didn't get an invite this year. This is a long journey, and one summit is not going to derail the issues. We've, I think, done well in having the last 4 summits hosted in the South, including Indonesia. And I think South Africa did well to try to manage very diverse constituencies. I think that's why you saw all these other countries, minus 1 or 2, largely being on board, et cetera, et cetera. Chair, I think also, broader foreign relations, we do have to kind of elevate South Africa's economic interest as we manage these complex, turbulent, often contradictory geopolitical tensions, et cetera. I think at times we forget that our international relations must be anchored upon South Africa's needs, need to attract investment, to create growth, to sustain jobs, to create new jobs, etc. And Chair, we will be vulnerable as a country to the inevitable geopolitical turbulence or climate change or natural disasters, conflicts, etc. There will always be some turbulence in the world, which we'll never be able to control. But we become vulnerable, Chair, if we don't address our own domestic challenges, if we don't ensure that the economy is growing, that unemployment is falling, if we don't fix the capacity of the state to deliver upon its mandates, etc., then yes, we'll be vulnerable because there will always be storms. So I think our point is that we must spend a bit more attention addressing our domestic crises. But at the same time, Chair, I think Governor is right. We must defend multilateralism as the way to resolve conflicts and to find solutions. We must reinforce non-alignment, and I think we must not also be naive and allow other countries to exploit us for their own interests. And we've seen that at times. Other countries would want to exploit us. We must be very careful of that. And I think we must just continuously re-emphasize our tradition of non-alignment, our history of believing in negotiated solutions for intractable conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. And I know, Chair, these things can be a little bit depressing at times. But chaos will pass. Storms always have an end, and this too will also pass. But I think what will count is that are we principled? Do we stick to our principles? Or are we seen to be contradictory in our principles? So I think those are things we must focus on, in addition to paying more attention to the region, to the continent, where our fundamental interests and future lies. So let me stop there, Chair, but let me say the last thing. We have frequent engagement with our colleagues in the US trade union movement. They share our frustrations. I'm not sure how will they navigate this year's G20, because I suspect that even they will not be invited. I suspect you will find this year that the Brazilian, South African precedents around including labor, business, civil society might also fall by the wayside, because I don't think that's the US government's cup of tea currently, but that's fine. We'll continue that thing, and that's why government, I think, is correct to engage with the British, to engage all the other G20 states, to say when we look at 2027, we resume those things, because those things are important, Chair, and we can see from our own South African experience the value of having a government which listens to business, to labor, to society, and tries to find solutions. So I think that's the correct approach of government, trying to elevate that on the global stage. So, Chair, let me stop there. Hopefully that added some value, made some sense. But yeah, thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Parks. I think your input was very excellent, especially speaking on the inclusive societies and the material conditions that workers face and the forever changing environment. And the pushback on South Africa is very unfortunate, but it's as you said, storms do pass, and that the international relations mechanisms should really focus on our own domestic challenges and addressing them, and also defending multilateralism and focusing on the non-alignment and not allowed to be bullied by other countries or exploit us. I think it's very that what you said about the people-to-people engagements that you carry on engaging in with the labor union in the United States. And I think that's also very important, and that we must be focusing on the continent and as well as our own domestic issues. I think it's also very important. Thank you very, very much for that. We're now going to be moving on to our next speaker, which is Professor Nanya Bola-Muller, who is the head of delegation and the chair of the Women 20 South Africa, which is South Africa's official engagement group of the G20, which is dedicated to advancing gender equality and as well as women's economic empowerment. And under her leadership, with the support of the Human Science Research Council, she has contributed to the development of the consensus-building policy recommendations, which are aimed at mainstreaming gender considerations within the G20 deliberations and with the leaders' declarations. Her work has also engaged with the G20's long-standing commitment to establishing the 2014 Brisbane Summit to reduce the gender employment gap and support broader multilateral frameworks promoting women's economic participation, including the UN's Agenda 2030. So over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am very pleased to be with you today. Thank you to SALO for instigating this incredibly important discussion. As Tebogo said previously, it's a very timely and relevant discussion, and I want to say that I do agree with that. So we are here, and we are in a bit of a wobbly period when it comes to the work of the G20, and that is acknowledged. So this is a retrospective and a prospective, and I'll be quite short because I know we're running out of time. And we want to look at what the role of W20 was within South Africa's G20 presidency, as well as how we continue in this complex and shifting global environment and the geopolitics that goes with it. As Busi mentioned, the G20 is the official, W20 is the official G20 engagement group for gender equality and women's economic empowerment. It is more than a mere forum. It has developed over the last 10 years into a movement. And this movement asserts that women's voices, women's labor, and women's leadership are not peripheral, but central to the future of democracy, sustainability, and human flourishing, as well as the health of the environment, of course. Sorry, I'm having a problem reading this because I've put it on very small font. So I'm going to continue with this by switching off my camera so you don't see the side of me, so I can read it on the other screen. Apologies for that. When we look back, W20 South Africa has been a beacon of Ubuntu, reminding the world that I am because we are. And I think that that was an important achievement of our presidency as well as the W20. We brought Ubuntu-based inclusion into global advocacy and ensured that care is seen as a public good and is embedded in the language of change. Our research and evidence drew from national projects and comparative constitutional studies which informed W20 recommendations on justice, governance, and participation. We positioned gender equality not as a siloed issue, but as a cross-cutting imperative, dealing with economic development, climate change, climate justice, and digital transformation. Through partnerships with BRICS, plus the African Union and IORA, we expanded W20's reach beyond the G20, ensuring that Global South voices were heard in shaping global gender policy. And as you heard from ECOSOC earlier, we did actively engage with the African Union. However, there were some issues. The Leaders' Declaration, only 12% of the Leaders' Declaration dealt with gender equality and women's economic empowerment. In this sense, we were happy to see that financial and digital inclusion, labor participation, care, and gender-based violence were properly addressed in the Leaders' Declaration. However, gender mainstreaming was not visible, and we saw that women's role in climate justice was not emphasized. And this is very important because it's not only about leadership, but it's also about financing mechanisms. So the question is, as mentioned, will civil society continue to operate under the umbrella of DIRCO and the Sherpas track? And I think that we'd really like to hear from DIRCO about this. This retrospective is not merely a list of achievements, and it's not all of them, but it is a legacy of W20, a legacy of care-conscious leadership, of ethical stewardship, and of resilience in the face of geopolitical challenges. And the pushback against women's rights is particularly bad currently, and we are concerned about this. We are concerned, for example, that we cannot attend the Commission of Gender Equality in New York in March of this year, because there are uncertainties about the granting of visas based on our social media interactions. But we look forward and we acknowledge the challenges of today's world. Rising geopolitical fragmentation has led to South Africa's exclusion from the 2026 G20 cycle in the United States. But as Matthew mentioned, it's not the end. We have the G20 UK Presidency in 2027. The climate crisis, digital disruption, and economic inequality continue to disproportionately affect women, and this must be recognized. And globally, the struggle for gender equality remains unfinished. And I mean, the data is there. But our exclusion will not mean our silence. It means that we will remain resilient, and it means that we will be innovative. It means finding new pathways to influence, however. Our prospective vision for W20 is that we will convene meetings outside of the US, hosted in South Africa or allied nations, to sustain visibility and momentum. But this is, of course, resource dependent. We will embed W20 outputs into BRICS and AU frameworks, ensuring continuity of women's voices in global governance. We will partner with other engagement groups if they agree to amplify gender equality across civil society, labor, think tanks, and youth. And we will collaborate with B20 if they agree to integrate gender equality into corporate commitments, ensuring women's economic empowerment is part of economic growth. So here we have been informed that B20 is the only engagement group recognized by the US presidency. Our prospective vision is not about being excluded. It is about the power of women to shape the future, even when formal recognition is denied to us. We need to reaffirm that women's empowerment isn't optional, that it is indeed important. It is essential. Essential for democracy, essential for sustainability, and essential for peace. And I think peace is the the word that is on our minds currently. W20 South Africa will continue to stand as a beacon of Ubuntu constitutionalism, ensuring that the voices of women are heard, respected, and acted upon, whether inside or outside of the G20. Our retrospective honors the past, and our perspective commits us to the future. We need to understand that we need to do this together, because together we rise. And that is proven by the engagement group's commitment to the G20 presidency and also working together. So when women rise, societies rise. When societies rise, humanities rise, and rise we must. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof, for the input. And I think it's really important that you are highlighting that the Women's 20 did elaborate and did expand into BRICS and the AU, and you're going to be continuing the W20 into the Global South and ensuring that gender policy is at the forefront, and that only about 12% of the Leaders' Declaration was speaking about the work that you've done. And I think there's more work that needs to be done. And it's very important that you're going to be continuing to have engagements outside of the USA, especially the people-to-people conversations. Those are extremely important in these kind of situations. And the pushback of South Africa not being in there is not necessarily the end of the road. You know, you're going to find other alternatives of engagement, which is very important. And sometimes the people-to-people engagement is actually more rich than having the conversation directly with politicians and governments. So continue that fight and all the best. Thank you very much. We're now going to be moving on to the next speaker, which is Dr. Anthony Costa, who is the head of security, the secretariat, sorry, of the B20 South Africa, which is the Business Unity of South Africa, so BUSA. It's responsible for hosting Business 20 in events last year. He has previously worked in the private office of the President of South Africa, leading the President's investment on mobilization programs and participating in several initiatives between government and the private sector. He is on a full-time secondment to the Nedbank Group Limited. So over to you, Dr. Costa.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to SALO for organizing this, as well as the previous sessions that you have organized throughout the year. Just to clarify, I'm on a full-time secondment from Nedbank to BUSA for purposes of running the B20. I think I'd like to also greet the colleagues from the other engagement groups, as well as DIRCO and the rest of the audience. And it's great to see that there's an ongoing interest in G20 and the related activities following the conclusion of South Africa's presidency. I've got a very short presentation that I won't go through in detail, but just to provide a bit of an overview as to the B20 and South Africa's contribution and how we feel in terms of some of the things that we did achieve and opportunities to take the work forward. So I think a lot of people would be familiar, hopefully, from previous SALO engagements, as well as other opportunities with the Business 20, the engagement group representing business across the G20. Effectively, we had some 8 task forces which produced papers. Each task force had members drawn from across the G20, and by that we include, of course, the member countries of the African Union and the European Union. Over 1,400 people in total, over 25 countries. I suspect it was more than that. And looking at these issues within these 8 task forces, we came up with 5 broad themes and 3 underlying commitments as well. And you can see here some of those key issues where we looked at, in particular, infrastructure through capital access, food security, sustainable and climate responsive economic systems, empowering Africa's digital and skills transformation, and unlocking Africa's industrialization across the critical minerals chain. And we stressed in particular the importance of partnerships and public-private partnerships appropriately governed and transparent to deliver these. Let me just skip that. We concluded with a summit in November. We are very fortunate that the President of South Africa, as President of the G20, joined us. as well as business leaders from South Africa predominantly, but also the continent and the globe were there to speak to some of the recommendations over a 2-day period. You'll see there, giving you a snapshot, we had probably just over 2,000 people in total. The majority of those were South African, but we did have attendance and participation from other key areas, including from the rest of the continent, and importantly as well, we thought from the USA, given that they are the next host, as well as the United Kingdom, who will host the G20 the year after that. We had a particular focus on gender participation and women's empowerment. You'll see that I think Brazil really moved the dial here. We try to continue that. We set targets of getting as close to 50% as we could in terms of task force leadership. We managed to achieve that. In terms of the broader participation, we are to a certain extent dependent on the participating countries of the G20 and businesses as well as organizational nominees from those, but we think it's certainly important to keep that on the map. We did so, and we'll continue to track this, whether it continues going forward. I think, Professor Muller indicated that there are certainly some unknowns around the next cycle. I'm not going to go through this at all, but just to indicate that we are doing some work in terms of tracking the alignment between G20 and B20. We think that the whole purpose of B20, as with other engagement groups, is of course to interact with the G20. It's to provide a platform for these components of civil society, be it labor, women, youth, to actually engage with the government-to-government process. And we had very good opportunities to do so. DIRCO and the other members of South Africa's G20 ecosystem were very open and supportive. That doesn't mean, as you will see, that we necessarily agreed and aligned on everything, but I think there was very broad alignment with the direction that South Africa took and a lot of the themes. We have seen where we did create strong alignment, where there was divergence, as well as at looking some of the outcomes and mechanisms. And this is an ongoing piece of work. We are quite conscious that we do not want this to be a single B20 cycle that then gets repeated from year to year, but to look at mechanisms for ensuring continuity and indeed impact. And I'll talk in a moment just about how we're working with the US to that effect. And then finally, we have what are called the legacy initiatives. There are some 11 of those in total, and these are specific initiatives, some of which come from previous B20s, such as the Carbon Knowledge Hub, as well as the Bloomberg Academy on climate, is now focusing on South Africa. Some are entirely new, reducing the cost of capital for Africa, and that aligns very closely with the South African-led initiative chaired by the former Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, into this important theme. It was one of the core recommendations of our Finance and Infrastructure Task Force. So BUSA will be working with specific partners across these 11 legacy initiatives to ensure that there is an ongoing impact rather than having this as a once-off event that simply stops. The big question, of course, is what happens now, particularly this year, given the United States hosting of the G20 and the fact that South Africa has not been invited or has been disinvited, if you like, to participate. We're in a very different position, fortunately, with business. The United States Chamber of Commerce has been a very strong partner and supporter of South Africa G20. We had a troika system with the US and Brazil throughout last year. The president of the US Chamber, Suzanne Clark, attended the handover and the summit and formally received, if you like, the mantle or the presidency of the B20 from our co-chair here, Mr. Xolisi Mgojo, and also was congratulated by President Ramaphosa. And we think that's important that they made that commitment to be here in person. And we do have an informal structure working with the US and the UK as well, going into next year, and potentially South Korea, who are the following host. The US has also made it quite clear that they see the papers emerging from the South African B20 as key starting points They don't anticipating revising or rewriting them. And what was quite important is they were active participants along with the other G20 countries. And I'd say the vast majority of countries were very actively engaged, or businesses from those countries. There were maybe 2 or 3 who were less involved, but some of the key players, including the US, China, countries from around the continent, Europe and Latin America, and we managed to find consensus on recommendations. There were obviously issues where there was some degree of divergence, but notwithstanding that, we, I think, managed to achieve some good progress around the ultimate recommendations, including those being adopted by the B20 in the United States. The US Chamber of Commerce, the host of the US B20, is up and running and operationalizing it. They are creating their task forces or action tracks, aligning with the US G20 task forces. We know that the United States is only having some 4 working groups, task forces, or action tracks. I think finance is clearly the most traditional, but then there are another 3 on energy, which is a slightly different approach to energy than perhaps has been taken in the past, on deregulation, efficiencies for business, and then finally on trade. And some of the B20 tracks will mirror that. Because the calendar for the G20, aside from finance, has not been finalized, I think the US B20 calendar is something that's also still under development. But certainly we've been asked to participate, and businesses from South Africa and the rest of the continent have been asked to participate. And we think it's a good opportunity for business to engage with the G20 process through B20 United States. In terms of the G20 and our understanding of what's taking place there, the US administration has explained its differences with South Africa. And I think while we disagree with those, as well as the reason for attempting to exclude South Africa, they do claim that the African Union will participate fully in G20 USA. And as the ambassador mentioned earlier, this is a vital opportunity for the structure and the structures of the AU to ensure that the African agenda that was developed during South Africa's G20 presidency remains relevant for the G20 USA. The B20 will continue to support that. We think that in many ways South Africa should continue to work with the African Union, and we should see how the institutions of the AU can serve as a channel and platform, but bearing in mind as well that not everything that we have achieved and want to implement is dependent on the G20. So we do have the capacity for autonomous and individual action. In many ways, we built good relationships and mobilized sectors during our B20 process, as did L20, W20, and other key stakeholders. And how do we continue to take that momentum, build on it, and continue to work? I think this is particularly true of the engagement groups, which may not have a formal presence under the US G20 structure, and then ensure that under the next presidency, namely the United Kingdom, there are those opportunities for formal engagement. And that would mean working with the United Kingdom as well as South Korea, because you can't do this on a year-to-year basis, to try and get commitments to reinstitutionalize what I think are quite vital mechanisms. So hopefully, Chair, that's provided an overview of what B20 has done, as well as our thoughts on the road ahead in the next year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Costa, for that input. And I think it's very important that you started off with women's participation over the years, and that you have a goal of 50% women's participation by the year 2030, and just the different areas that you are covering in SBUSA, which is mining, critical minerals, food, climate, sustainability, education, future of work, entrepreneurship, and finance capital. And it's good that you also highlighted that the chair or the Business Chamber of Commerce was present and did engage with B20 South Africa, and that there were consensus that was reached, and that also is going to continue engaging with the African Union, and not everything is dependent on the G20, which is good because you're building good relations and stakeholders outside of the G20, which is taking the momentum and continuing the work. And that in the next presidency, you hope to formalize those engagements. So thank you very much for that. The next speaker we have is Mr. Makotsi Koyala, who is the co-chair of the Y20 South Africa, which is the oldest engagement group across the G20 engagements. He is an education and training officer in youth activism at the Ahmed Katharja Foundation, serves as the national chairperson of the National Youth Coalition. He also represents the foundation within the foundations for the national dialogue process. His professional background includes work in training and development at the Center for Student Development at the University of the Witwatersrand. He also holds a master's degree in sociology from the University of the Witwatersrand, as well as the research focusing on masculinity among male university students, and as well as an honors degree and a bachelor's degree in sociology and psychology. His work is at the intersection of gender, violence, youth participation, and government, with the focus on inclusion, accountability, and social transformation.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Just to double check, am I audible?
Yes, you are, and we can see a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, colleagues. And for the sake of time, I'd also just like to stand on established protocol through you, Chair. So, colleagues, we are gathered here to reflect, as per the invitation that's been sent by the SALO colleagues on the relevance of civil society engagement in G20 and, of course, broader multinational processes as we go forward. Like Dr. Costa, I'm also going to rush through my presentation for the sake of time to enable the colleagues on the platform to come in as well and engage with us. So in terms of us, as the Y20, perhaps a useful starting point is really, what was our key theme for those who didn't know about our engagement group. And as the program director has said, we are the oldest engagement group in the social track of the G20 in terms of the engagement groups. And really, we came together as young people by mobilizing ourselves, conscientizing ourselves, and of course, organizing ourselves under young people who are going to build bridges by uniting for solidarity, championing equality, and of course, driving sustainability. Through these 5 thematic tracks that you're seeing on your left. The first one being climate change and environmental sustainability. In essence, what were those green horizons and really what does it mean for us as young people when we want to say we want to lead a just energy transition? The second one really was on inclusive economic growth and employment. And again, what are those pathways to prosperity, given, of course, the knowledge that we have that, of course, young people, not only in this country, but, across the continent, are the ones who are making the loudest noise in terms of, unemployment levels and so on. The third one really for us as young people under the Y20 was on AI, digital innovation, education, and of course, the future of work. Here, we really just wanted to innovate, to really elevate, and really what does it mean for us when we say we want to build those key competency skills for tomorrow. The fourth one, which also I think speaks to today's topic at hand, was around what does meaningful youth engagement and reforming multilateralism for a just future look like for young people, given our knowledge that we know that, of course, we are hungry for opportunities as young people, particularly in the multilateral space, whether it's your UN agencies, but also the multilateral organizations that exist within the African continent. And of course, one of the colleagues is here from the ECOSOC in the continent. And really the last one for us was on inclusive social development and fighting inequality. And here for us as Y20, we were quite committed to say we want to leave no one behind, particularly given that we know that sometimes, these multilateral spaces that we're in can be seen to be elite spaces. And that is why for us, really as the Y20, we also embarked on provincial outreach shows when we partnered with the G20 education working groups that enabled us to travel the length and breadth of, the 9 provinces in the country and really taking Y20 to its rightful custodians, the young people in the rural villages, in the townships and so on, right? And for us, really, we're moved by the commitment that, whether young people know about the G20 or the Y20 or not, it was our business as the Y20 core leadership team, but also the various working group members and the delegates to make sure that they know about, the Y20. And really, in terms of our own achievements, program director, we would have met in Ekurhuleni, and of course, between the 18th and 22nd of August for our main summit. But I think it's also important for me to highlight that even before our main summit, it was important for us to, go out there in terms of those provincial outreach programs, but also, those were also informed by some of the policy negotiations that took place virtually with our international counterparts in the G20. Right. And really, yes, at our main summit, we did not reach, a consensus in terms of an official communique. And out of that, really, the chair summary was then birthed, given that you are allowed in the G20 processes. If there isn't an official communique, you can go the route of a chair summary that basically highlights, some of the key takeaways, but also some of the things that we're able to agree on, moving on principle. And really for us, in terms of, some of the things that we really, the policy outcomes, and I'm really going to highlight a few here. So, I mean, really just under climate change, one of the things that we were able to, agree on was, the importance and recognizing that we do need some form of, just energy transition framework, right? But also, how do we come up with, protections, that are much more concrete and strong around, biodiversity, sustainable food systems, and of course, responsible mineral supply chains and so on, right? But we moved the margin, program director, to actually say that also, what would implementation look like, for example, if we were to implement these policies? And one of the things that, under climate change that we resolved to in terms of implementation was that, for example, we were also involved and invited a lot to some of the energy transitions working group, who also form part of the G20. And one of the things that we were able to engage, particularly with ESCOM here in our country through their own energy conferences, that, electricity can end poverty, right? What does it look like, in terms of addressing the energy trilemma that we've been faced with as a country for so long in terms of affordability, access, and of course, sustainability, right? And for us, really, one of our key recommendations with the energy transitions working group, but also with an entity like ESCOM, which played a key role in that, is that really for us, energy and development are really, inextricably linked, but also, access to clean and safe energy is a great enabler of socioeconomic development, right? And again, as I said, I'm going to rush through this and I'm only going to share that one. And I'm happy to share these slides for the colleagues, to meditate and deliberate on. But before I wrap up, Program Director, in terms of our way forward for us as the Y20 South Africa 2025, one of the things that we called for really last year was the institutionalization of the Y20 through a Y20 Alumni Association or a Y20 Council, right? And really this, for us, we've imagined it as a permanent mechanism to coordinate youth engagement across the G20 tracks, civil society, and of course, national systems, given our recognizing that current youth engagement mechanisms, they really lack continuity, institutional memory, and of course, accountability. And one of the things that has been mentioned here by my other colleagues who came before me was, which really spoke to one of our fears last year was, will these engagement groups continue into the current incumbency of the G20, the United States? And of course, given today's topic at hand, I think we can all recognize that civil society organizations, have long played a critical role, not only in South Africa, engaging communities, we provide essential services, we advocate for human rights, we monitor government performance, but also we partner with both the state and development partners. But again, when we do reflect on, the current role of civil society, we remain vital actors in advancing the country's democracy, but also we strengthen its service delivery ecosystem. But however, we are also facing, significant challenges, Program Director, including limited institutional capacity, financial sustainability constraints, and even engagement with the state, but also, of course, internal issues of inclusivity and representation. And also, again, when we look at and when we reflect on some of the recent reports, around civil society, we are also, seeing, this increasingly heightened, the steady shrinking of the civic space around the world, even as social, political, and economic challenges continue to overwhelm, governments. And I think we can also recognize here that, many CSOs, we now find ourselves grappling with financial strain, limited resources, and growing demand at the same time for our services. And of course, one example that one can give was how that situation was also just further compounded by the withdrawal of significant USAID funding early in 2025, and really how that sudden policy shift created a dire scenario for many organizations, really forcing project closures, staff reductions, and in some cases complete shutdowns. And I think for me, as I contribute in today's discussion here with the colleagues, and I'm just going to quickly stop sharing my screen. And just a few recommendations that have also been inspired by, I think, the first speaker of today in terms of the ambassador. And one of the things that I also just wanted to contribute towards, the ambassador spoke about, this Global South coalitions. And I thought about it as, what would a South-to-South social movement convergence look like? Particularly where I think we can all recognize that, we have many connected struggles and we've got many voices, but really what the South-to-South, South-to-South social convergence, what would a gathering really look like of social movement leaders, of activists, of artists, of scholars, not only from this continent of Africa, but also of Asia and Latin America, given the contemporary social issues those countries are going through, right, where it is designed in a way that we are able to examine, program director, how youth activism in particular, but also social movements are reshaping democracy, but also the ways in which we're confronting authoritarianism across the global south, right? How do we, create opportunities for co-creating tools, not only for civic architecture, cross-border solidarity, but also how do we build these new partnerships for advancing democratic renewal in the south? And I think, the other opportunity that we perhaps have is that this year also, South Africa, we are also the interim chairperson of, SADC. That is also an opportunity for us as young people to deliberate around what does it look like to advance industrialization, agricultural transformation, and of course, energy transition for a resilient SADC as per the SADC's, thematic area. But also as part of building these bridges, program director, one of the other things that I think is an opportunity for us as young people to converge and disrupt that space is, again, was mentioned here by the colleague from DECO around, the World Economic Forum's decision to entrust, again, our country, South Africa, with hosting the World Economic Forum Africa Summit in 2027. Program director, for the sake of time, allow me to leave it there. And I think any other thing that I wasn't able to cover in terms of time, I'm happy to answer any engagements or comments when you allow the other colleagues to come in through the Q&A. Program director.
Thank you very much, Ruketsi, for that very comprehensive input. And I think it's very important that your presentation highlighted that the Y20 and the G20 were very much aligned in their theme areas and the different thematic groups and tracks that young people participated in. And for a very successful Y20 summit that was hosted, it is very important that you also had the provincial roadshows, which is bringing, the G20 and Y20 conversations to young people, specifically in the township and rural areas. I think that's a very key important aspect of it. And also the institutionalizing of the Y20 into Y20 Council, and also highlighting the challenges therefore moving forward. We're now going to be going to our last and final speaker, which is Mr. Briggs Boma, who serves as a program director for Africa Trust, which is a pan-African foundation that works across Africa to promote democratic governance and equitable development. Mr. Briggs holds a master's degree in applied and social economics from the University of Wright State University in Ohio, South Africa, USA. His analysis and commentary have appeared on CNN, BBC, World Focus, All Africa, Alliance Magazine, Foreign Policy in Focus, Pambazuko News, News Hour with Jim Lehrer and Al Jazeera, as well as Rev. Jesse Jackson's Keeping Hope Alive show, among other platforms. So over to you, Mr. Boma.
Hi, Chair. I don't think Briggs is with us in the meeting. I don't think he's been able to join.
Okay, that's perfectly fine. All right, so then what we're going to do is move on to the second part of our session, which is the Q&A. And how it's going to work is that you can use the reaction sign here to put your hand up, and you can quickly introduce yourself and ask your question directly to any of the panelists. And also noting that while the panelists were making inputs, there were questions that were directly asked to other panelists, So I'd just like to ask that once you're answering the questions that were asked, can you also please then cover the questions that were directly asked by other panelists? I think there wasn't a question that I remember off the top of my head, specifically for Durko. So I'm going to look at my screen. I'm now opening up the floor to take hands directly to the speakers. And we'll take a round of 3 hands first and then give back to the speakers. I'm just going to open up and look at the chat box to see, or any comments as well. I'm just going to give it, okay. So I see the first hand is from Lwazi. I'm just going to note you for now and just look at the chat to see if there's any more. Okay, I see a second hand raised from Sismali. And I'm just going to look again to see if there's a third hand before I hand over to you. Okay, there, and then I see one from Miriam. So we're going to go in that order. So Lwazi, Sismali, and Miriam, asked your questions in that order. And please remember, panelists, to answer the questions that other fellow panelists have asked. Thank you. Over to you, Lwazi.
All right. Thank you so much, Busi, and thank you, SALO, and thank you to the panelists for this very important meeting. I would like to also thank the engagement groups and ECOSOC for also contributing very much during South Africa's presidency, especially for concerning the social summit, because that was a very important meeting that South Africa had. As it was a means of democratization of foreign policy and how we engage as normal civil society with the foreign policy realm, along with how do we now contribute in order to ensure the international relations is democratic from the ground up. From the social summit and the leaders summit, there were 13 areas of convergence between the leaders declaration and the social summit declaration, and which is a major advancement considering that this is the second social summit that South Africa had during the G20. This is the second social summit that the G20 has had, it being first initiated in Brazil by President Lula da Silva and South Africa carrying it on. Well, whilst we're seeing now is that there's a high probability and doubt that this legacy of civil society participation will continue during the Donald Trump administration, as the G20's agenda has been narrowed down, and we suspect there to be a much exclusion of the Sherpa track initiatives that were initiated in both Brazil and the Global South G20s. Now, there is commentary from the panelists that says that we need to also move some of the G20 agenda items to the other multilateral forums. So I would like to ask our Durko and ECOSOC colleagues, number one, how much are we now concentrating on other multilateral institutions such as the United Nations Economic Committee, the COP meetings, the other decision-making bodies such as the World Economic Forum, along with other institutions such as the United Nations itself and the African Union and SADC, in order for us to filter through some of the recommendations and declarations made in these declarations. And number two, going forward, how does now civil society participation in multilateral fora, and especially considering the South African government's approach towards democratization of multilateral fora, add towards South Africa's foreign policy approach going forward, take into consideration the social summit was the second one ever, and how does South Africa now plan on plugging in not only the resolutions and declaration from the G20 itself, but in other multilateral fora, fully recognizing that the G20 itself is a consensus-based decision-making body, but it's a non-binding consensus-based decision-making body. So those are my few questions, and thank you, SALO, for hosting such an important meeting as we wrap up South Africa's G20 tenure. Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thanks, Lwazi. I'm just going to quickly, before I go to Sismali, also just read out the chat in the questions in the chat before I hand over to Sismali and comments. So the first one is from Kundai Ngwenya, who says, "Thank you, Ambassador Karoo, for providing a clear-cut presentation and a sustainable way forward." Another one is from Ellen Lomer, who says, "Thanks for a great input in highlighting the steps to maintaining the legacy of SA's G20 and hosting specifically the context of its exclusion from the USA." There's another one, a question from Richard Worthington, who says, "There are commendable ideas for strengthening the role and efficiency of ECOSOC, but is the G20 the most appropriate thematic focus? given the pressing challenges that should and could be addressed by the G20 and other various multilateralism processes, perhaps we need a more cross-cutting focus objectives that will be more conducive to the additional capacity and having a real impact. And some examples are energy access, climate, and global financial architecture. So that's just a question, I think, for ECOSOC, and then over to you, Sis Molly. Then
Okay, thank you, Busi. Am I audible? I'm not so sure if I am.
clear.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, and greetings to you, Program Director Busi, and to the panelists. Thank you for the presentations, and greetings to everyone in the platform. Most of my questions are directed to Mr. Mnguni, so I'll start with him. Will DECO also present the global inequality report to SADC? I heard you mention that it will be presented to the AU and to the AU and to the UN. And then the second question has to do with us being uninvited or whatever it is. Are we going to be engaging with the country that will host the following year? The UK, in order to get these streams back now that the back to basics approach of the US is removing the other streams and only focusing on the more economic ones. And lastly, so are we already engaging with the UK, Mr. Mnguni? And then lastly, on the question of debt, which we thought was also very important for us as Africans, during our presidency, the issue of debt cancellation or debt relief for Africa, is it or issues of the need for the transformation of the tax regime, all those kind of issues. In your own assessment, how do you think we have fared when it comes to making inroads in regard to that question, and with the UK presidency, do you think we can find space with the UK G20 presidency? Do you think we can find space to bring back, those debates? We are glad that at least last year there was a bit of a reminder about the cancellation of the third world, the cancellation of the debt that most African countries owe. Most of us were reminded of the time of the Jubilee 2000 in the year 2000. Yes, are the spaces to continue with this? Lastly, my question to Matthews Parks: are we considering that South Africa will not be going to the US? Is Labour engaging with Labour in the US? Do you know if there's any role that Labour in the US will be playing? The Federation, FLCIO, and I don't know if we do have affiliates also here in the platform, of our federation and other federations. And also just wondering if they will also engage with their counterparts in the sectors that they operate in. Thank you very much. Thank you, Busi.
Thank you, Sis Molly. Now over to Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you, Busi, and thanks to all the panelists, and greetings to all participants. Mine is also on what Molly and I think Lwazi touched on this, the interim measures taken to ensure that what was achieved during the recent G20 hosted by SA is not either diluted or put way on the wayside. I did hear from Derko and others that there are engagements at various levels, and yes, and also ECOSOC proposed that you know, an approach of working through other multilateral agencies and platforms. However, it would be interesting to know how, what measures have been put in place, the interim measures, as it has been repeatedly indicated, and we know that SA may not be invited. So the interim measures that are in place, so that we don't lose out on what on South Africa's presidency's achievement. The last one is just a clarity-seeking question, but also, on the women's G20 voices. I think the presenter indicated that there's a rising pushback on gender equality issues, and I think it's across the globe. We in South Africa have also experienced, a decline somehow, or a pushback somehow. What measures are being put in place that the situation is kept, or it doesn't continue and rise throughout the world, but also to thank everyone for the update, but also the presentations on the issues that were raised. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Just before I hand over to the speakers to respond, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Deboko, who will take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Busi. Before we hand over to the speakers, I see there's one more hand from, I think it's Pamela or Pamela. I don't want to mispronounce your surname, but please do come in.
Hi, thank you very much. It's Pamela, and the surname is Gopal. Thank you very much. I'm from the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and thank you for hosting this SALO. I think it's a very good discussion, and it's great that we're helping keep the momentum, even if it's through discussion. I just wanted to add from the African Union's perspective, that when we ask what's happening in the engagement groups, whether it's the L20, Y20, B20, the US groups are faced with a similar dilemma because the government decided not to host these engagement groups. From the African Union perspective, we were encouraged to continue our discussions, possibly not in the name of the G20 now, but we keep the momentum of what the essence and the core of what we have put into gear, so that when next year the UK takes over, we can just continue wherever we left. But the important thing is to keep the momentum and ensure that the same engagement groups that we have been engaging with, that we work and deliver on that. I think it is really important to keep the momentum, to unify. The first speaker, Ambassador William from ECOSOC, I think I'm working with some of his members in his team as the AU organ. ECOSOC is an AU organ, so is the AUD and NEPAD, an AU organ. On the 11th of February, in the margins of the AU Summit, we are having a briefing of the African ambassadors to actually host it as well, together with SAIA, to brief the African ambassadors on what actually came out of this, so that the AU, who's been in close contact with Washington, are taking up some of the priority areas, but specifically in finance, because that is the focus of it. So I'm saying that the word solidarity that Ambassador Williams spoke about from ECOSOC earlier, it's really up to us and the South African government to utilize the AU summit to gain that solidarity among the member states, because we can see that the route that the US is taking is rule and divide route. And we need to make sure that we maximize the opportunity and the platform when given the opportunity with policymakers in the room. And the AU Summit is a perfect way to do it. We can talk as much as we want on these dialogues, which is really rich and healthy, but we don't have the right people on these platforms. So I think it's encouraged that all the representatives in the core should make sure that that these are taken up at the AU level. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I'm going to move to our speakers to respond to the questions given, but there's just one more question in the chat. And then after that, if there are no more, if there are no other contributions from participants or any other questions, then maybe each speaker can, in answering their questions, also maybe give some of their parting shots as we draw to a close in this dialogue. The last question in the chat is from Given Sebey, and it says, how do we deal with the US's selective and self-serving interaction with the world and South Africa, particularly as seen through the 30% tariffs, but exempting our critical minerals and excluding South Africa from the US G20 program, yet allowing our P20 participation? So I'm going to give it back now to the speakers to respond to the questions that were posed to them during the meeting. Ambassador Karura, I don't think is with us anymore. He had a prior engagement, so we will jump straight to Mr. Masocha Mgwini from DIRCO, if he's still with us in the meeting.
Yes, thank you, Tebogo. I'm still here, and also thanks to the colleagues for the very excellent comments and questions. Let me start with, I think this is a cross-cutting question which was raised by more than one person in terms of how then do we take some of these deliverables or outcomes to the multilateral fora. I did, in the intervention, I think, state that we are going to be taking some of the work we have done, especially the reports we have commissioned to the African Union and the United Nations, especially those that are aligned with the priorities of the AU, bearing in mind, of course, that the AU is a G20 member in its own right, and also the fact that there was a close collaboration between ourselves and the African Union during our presidency. Even in this year where we are not invited to the US presidency of the G20, we still, of course, coordinate quite closely with the AU to ensure that some of these outcomes still continue to find expression in the work of the G20. As has been said, even though South Africa is not participating this year, that doesn't mean that the work we have done ceases to exist. The G20 report, it is not a South African document. It is a G20 document that the G20 will continue to use as a reference point when looking at how it should arrange itself to be fit for purpose, particularly because of the level of input which went in from all G20 members. We should also take into consideration that the G20 is an informal grouping. It is not a parallel, a formal UN structure. As our Sherpa Director General Zain Dango likes to mention, it is a ginger group because of the sheer size and influence of the G20, what the G20 adopts on debt, on climate, on science and technology is bound to influence discussions happening within the UN system. I'll make an example of the G20 Common Framework on Debt. That outcome, although it is from the G20, it is a reference point whenever the IMF, World Bank, and other formal UN institutions are discussing the issues of debt. So it is envisaged that even some of these outcomes and reports, like we are doing with the inequality report, they are bound also to influence ongoing discussions on those topics. And then when it comes to the question of civil society participation, I did say that, of course, when we are going to be mobilizing a support for some of these deliverables we are seeking to take to the international fora, we are going to consult widely. In actual fact, the groundwork that led us to be where we are with some of these reports we celebrate today, they were largely because of the level of input we got from civil society. You look at the bulk of the participation or the panelists from the panel, which was led by former Minister Trevor Manuel, and even the one led by Professor Stiglitz. They were mainly from civil society. So as we go to the African Union, there are reach outs we are going to be doing with a civil society there on the continent, but also, of course, before we go to the General Assembly, we will ensure that we have the necessary input from civil society in all these legacy projects we are taking forward. Then, with regard to the questions on whether we will take the inequality report to SADC, of course, SADC has a different working methods as opposed to the AU. When it comes to us presenting to the AU, we take into consideration the fact that we were collaborating closely with the AU, which is a G20 member in its own right. But of course, if we were to be requested then to take this matter forward to our region SADC, I don't think that would be a challenge, especially bearing in mind that this year and next year South Africa is the chair of SADC. And then on the invitation to the UK presidency in 2027, as far as we are aware, South Africa will be, as a founder member of the G20, be participating in this presidency. Actually, when there was a first Sherpa meeting of the US G20 presidency, we received a strong support from many countries in the North on the need for South Africa's continuing participation, including the UK itself. And we do not see a situation where there would be a continuation of this reduced agenda that we currently see under the US presidency. We expect that by 2027, the G20 will return to its normal settings of having a Sherpa track with 15 working groups, finance track, 8 working groups, engagement groups, and so on. That is our expectation for 2027. And then on the question of debt, yes, the declaration, I think, is quite clear in terms of where we are going on the issue of debt and the changes we want to see in the future. I did make reference to the G20 ministerial declaration on debt sustainability. That is the framework then which is going to determine how we address the question of debt. I made reference to the additional initiatives like the panel report, which was led by former Minister Trevor Emmanuel, which raises issues of the cost of capital, as well as the matter of the need for African credit rating agencies, and also emanating from the debt declaration is how we further strengthen the implementation of the G20 common framework for debt treatments beyond the debt service suspension initiatives. And then on the issue of the interim measures to implement the outcomes, the questions of continuity, like I said, even though we are not part of the G20 this year, we will continue to be engaging outside, working with all stakeholders to ensure then that all these legacies do not fall within the cracks. I think I answered in terms of how we will be doing that through forums such as the AU and the United Nations. And then lastly, there was the question on pushback on gender issues and other matters linked to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, you look at the declaration in terms of how we managed to secure this language in our presidency. We were very clear when there were still these discussions as to whether we will have a declaration or we will have a chair statement. We did say that our aim is to ensure that there shall be no pushback in the G20 at the time South Africa is chairing the group, and that we managed to achieve, despite strong pushback from the likes of the United States, Argentina, who disassociated from the declaration because of those specific issues. But you look at what we have in the declaration, it is, I think, a very ambitious language that strengthens the cause on these issues, and at a time where there is a strong determination by some to reverse the many gains we have fought for over the years. Thank you very much, Facilitator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mguni. I'm noting that Mr. Parks has left the meeting. Sorry, is there something else?
Yes, I think there was another one on the, I think it was a question posted in the chat on how we deal with the US selective and self-serving interaction and so on. Yeah, on that one thing which needs to be clear is that we can't dictate to the US in terms of how they should organize their presidency and agenda. They have decided to drive the agenda. They have put forward. On our side, we have been very clear that we will continue engaging, irrespective, of course, of some of the some of the the actions that have been directed towards us by the administration. We do have a formal track which has been set up by the president, in which then the two sides continue to engage on the issues related to trade, tariffs, and other matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Parks has left the meeting as well. He also had a prior commitment. So if Professor Bola Miller's ready for us.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, facilitator, for allowing me to address the questions around gender equality. I think that it is important for us to consider the pushback and the importance of women's rights, gender equality, and women's economic empowerment. Ms. Gopal from SADC has given us a very good idea of participating in AU activities and the AU summit. This year, I think it would be great if the engagement groups could receive formal invitations to do so, as a result of the fact that we are not working, it appears, with the Sherpa's office this year. So we would encourage, based on the US's pushback on women's rights, but also exclusion of South Africa, that we definitely continue to operate within the W20. We have not been recognized as an official engagement group, but we are engaging with W20 in the US because they are also members of civil society. And so we will be participating unofficially this year, and hoping that we can influence the agenda of Women 20, even though not recognized as an official engagement group. So I think those are just general responses, but I know that we are losing participants as we're over time.
Thank you. Dr. Costa, are you still with us?
Yes, thanks, facilitator. I don't think there were any specific B20 questions as such. I think in terms of just coming back to the question of the US, as far as we know, the B20 is the only engagement group that'll proceed formally, but the US government hasn't said anything about that, just to say that the US Chamber is taking that approach. And I think that aligns with the administration's policy, as well as their focus on financial and economic issues. And they haven't specifically invited South Africa. That doesn't sit with the US government, but that stays with the US Chamber of Commerce as the organizer of the B20. So I think certainly in terms of our relationship and understanding, the US administration has kept the G and the B processes very separate. And so we are continuing to participate as business and to build on the good business connections we have. And if that does contribute to better relationships and having a voice at the table for issues that have been raised in South Africa's G20, then we will certainly continue to do so. Thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss these issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Costa. Mr. Kwaila, Mwiketsi, do you have any parting shots that you want to offer?
Sure. Thank you so much, Program Director. Yeah, there were also no specific Y20 questions, but I think on my side, I was also just quite lobbied by one of the speakers, Ms. Pamela Gopal from the AU, because one of the things that we also engaged with as Y20 last year is that we also had gotten a delegation as per our 5 thematic tracks from the AU Directorate on Gender, Women, and Youth. And I think for us, one of the things that we also tried to do last year with regards to our engagements with the AU, but also with the Youth Caucus in the Pan-African Parliament, is how do we also, given the current geopolitical climate that we're navigating, also lobby for the G20 presidency, perhaps, whilst it's in the global north, for it to perhaps even come back again to the south through the AU, right? And that's one of the things that we've been trying to lobby for within the AU, because I do think, these current times that we're navigating globally do require us in the global south, whether through a coalition or some movement building, to come together and actually, make sure that, we move on our priorities. Because I think any analysis of the current climate in the global north, particularly the US, I think it's quite safe to say that, the movement of right wing, the right wing conservatism rather, and all those things, they are moving on their plans, right? And I think for those of us who consider ourselves progressive, many of us in this call, we get derailed by many, by the infights and all those things. So I think for me, we need more solidarity, not less, more working together, not less, right? We'll deal with the things that we're not, agreeing on later on. But I do think now more than ever, we need to come together as the Global South through some sort of solidarity platform that, we're able to push forward these particular issues or policy issues that we need to implement for a better and safe future. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mwiketsi. And to the rest of the speakers, we appreciate you guys for availing yourselves today. I'm not going to give too much of a lengthy closing. I'll leave that for my colleague Samantha. Samantha Isaac will be delivering some closing remarks. But just on my side, to thank you guys all for joining today. Even though we've run a bit over time, we thank you guys for your ever presence in our meetings and our participants as well. Thank you guys very much for being with us today. Samantha?
Thank you, Tebogo. Hi, greetings everyone. My name is Samantha Isaac from the Southern African Liaison Office. I'd like to extend thanks to the speakers for their depth and clarity of their reflections today. Your contributions have helped ground this discussion in informed and sustained engagement with the G20 process, while also pushing us to think more critically about influence and strategic possibilities for civil society engagement going forward. I would also like to thank all participants for your active engagement. The quality of today's dialogue reflects not only the expertise in the room, but a shared commitment to ensuring the multilateral processes remain responsive to public concerns, and particularly those emerging from Africa and the Global South. On behalf of SALO, I would like to express our deep appreciation to the Ford Foundation for its sustained support throughout our G20 dialogues over the past year. This support has enabled us to convene inclusive spaces for reflection, debate, and exchange at a moment when questions about global governance, accountability, and representation are especially pressing. We are equally grateful to the many colleagues and partners who have participated in SALO's dialogues over the course of South Africa's G20 presidency. Your continued engagement has been central to building continuity across discussions and to ensuring that civil society perspectives are not episodic, but part of a longer term conversation about influence and relevance in the multilateral fora. As the G20 moves from a presidency rooted in the Global South to one anchored in the Global North, today's discussion serves as an important pause. It reminds us that the end of a presidency does not mark the end of civil responsibility or opportunity. Rather, it underscores the need for sustained strategic engagement that carries lessons forward into 2026 and beyond. Thank you once again for your time, your insights, and your ongoing commitment to this work. We look forward to continuing these conversations in the future.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Thanks once again to everyone for joining. Have a good rest of your day, and we hope to see you in our future dialogues. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you for everything. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.